Hi, everybody. This is Matthew Poes of Poes Acoustics, and I'm answering questions. So, GJ Hunter 9326 made a $14.99 donation. You got to love how these. Apparently, I didn't know this. I couldn't figure out why people were giving such odd donations. Apparently, it makes recommendations, and that's what it does. Where that extra penny, like, what are you getting a better deal? It's very weird. So thanks. Hey, Matthew, I have some questions regarding setting up and optimizing bass and general acoustics for medium-sized home theaters. He's saying around 2,500 cubic feet. I'll just say, I think 2,500 is actually not really medium-sized. That would be small-medium. It matters how we discuss this. A lot of content is available on optimization of subwoofers for seat to seat consistently, mostly for multiple row seating. And the consensus seems to be that 4 subs is probably optimal. Welty, of course, I'm not referring to Trinnov waveforming or direct art. My question is, what about for a single row theater, perhaps 2 to 4 seats across, where you want a great MLP and reasonable consistency for the outer 2 positions? Are 2 subs as effective in this scenario as, or are 4 still optimal? When placing subwoofers, should they be positioned off the floor to combat room modes, or is floor positioning preferred to add some reinforcement? All right, so I'm going to start there and then get into the next one. So there may be some confusion. When you're using a multi-sub approach, placing the subwoofers up against boundaries is often preferred. If you're going to pull them out of the boundaries, you have to put them into a very specific position. So if you look at Welty's work, there were a number of positions that were optimal. So position option number 1 would be to stick them in all 4 corners. And 4 subs was definitely better than 2, but 2 could be made to work, but often not the way people think. Option number 2 was the midpoints. So that was the middle of the front wall, middle of the back, and middle of the side walls. Another good position was the quarter point. So you could pull them in 1/4 from the wall. And if you pulled them in 1/4 this way from the side walls and 1/4 in from the front and back walls, that was better. But actually, think in 3D space here, pulling them up 1/4 off the floor and 1/4 down from the ceiling could also be good if you were doing that. In that particular scenario, I just said from the ceiling, you have like 8 subwoofers for that, but you could do it with 4 and move them up. But that's not, I wouldn't call that a great option. So in general, lifting subwoofers off the floor is not a good idea. One of the things it causes is floor bounce. So what happens is now you've got a potentially low frequency null and peak that gets created from the distance between the subwoofer and the floor, as well as the ceiling. Whereas if you have it on the floor, you only have that for the ceiling. You don't have that for the floor. So in general, I prefer to keep them on the floor and up against boundaries. The quarter position one is that one exception where it can work quite well if you do it right, but it's tricky to do that. Most people can't put subwoofers there. Like in my room, they would be a trip hazard if I was to do that. The better thing, I think, is to do the corners or the midpoints. I find those work good. If you really don't want to do 4 and you want to stick to 2, if you do the midpoint of the front wall and the midpoint of the back wall, or the midpoint of the side walls, one or the other, those are the best positions. What I wouldn't do is stick them in the front corners or the back corners, or the front quarter points, because those are not as good as, the front quarter points can be okay, but none of that is as good as that front middle and front back or sidewall middle positions. Those are better positions for this. Now, as to whether, so I think there's a little bit of confusion. So Hunter here says that he's finding that this seems to be optimized for multiple rows. That actually is optimized for multiple spatial positions. It isn't just about multiple rows. And so a single row with multiple seats is still multiple spatial positions. So the advantage of a single row is you have the ability to move the seats forward and back so that if you have a particular seat where there seems to be some nulls or peaks, nulls being the worst to deal with, you can move the seats forward or back to get a better result. And then potentially everybody gets a better result from that in that one row. When you have 2 rows or 3 rows, that's harder to do because you compromise the rest of the rows when you do that. Not each don't have room for that. So there is some advantage to being able to still move things around, but like 4 subs is still the better way to go, whether you've got 1 row or 2 rows. The issue where you may not need all these subwoofers if you're just trying to get a good, smooth, flat response is not whether you have 1 row versus 2 rows. It's whether you have 1 seat versus more than 1 seat. So if you have only 1 seat, you can optimize the performance without having to go through all this with multiple subs. But If you do have multiple seats and you're trying to get as good bass as possible, I would recommend 4 subwoofers. If you don't want to do 4 subwoofers because of space or cost, 2 can be made to work quite well. It's just that most people put the 2 subs in the wrong place. So what I typically see is they've got their left, center, right, and then they have the subwoofers between the left and center and right and center on the floor. And it's often not the quarter position. It's either too far in or not far enough in, depending on the way the system has been designed. Very often in the rooms, it's too far in. And they're really placed there because I think you guys see this done on forums a lot, and it's convenient, not because it's the right position. In fact, I've seen a lot of situations where what people have done is that what we call the sound to visual coherence is all screwed up. So you've got like a 65-inch or a 75-inch, maybe even an 85-inch TV, but instead of having the speakers on either side of the TV, because that actually would be too close because you're actually sitting way too far back from a TV of that size because it's not big enough for your seating position, you push the speakers out farther. Now there's many, many feet between the speaker and the screen, and you've got the subwoofer sitting kind of in between. What you would be better off doing to improve that overall performance is actually to push the speakers in, move the subwoofers into the corners. That would give you better performance. And then move yourself closer to get the right viewing angle. If you don't like that, hey, don't use a TV. All right, the second question is in regard to a general acoustic treatment approach for the front wall when using an AT screen. Is absorption, diffusion, or a combination generally best? I've historically used absorption on the front and back walls and at the first reflection points and then transition diffusion further into the room. I'm not sure if this is the correct approach. As always, thanks for the great info. Okay, so I've talked about this and I'm going to go into it again. You're going to hear, I think every top acoustician that I work with makes the same point. I know there are guys that disagree with this, but I don't work with them. Maybe for a reason. But I think if they thought about it, they would agree with this. What first reflection point are you referring to? So in a multi-channel system, which is what we're talking about here, you've got many speakers. You've got a left, a center, a right. You've got side surrounds, you've got back surrounds, and you've got tops. Every one of those speakers has multiple first reflections. So when you say you use absorption on the first reflections, to do that, you'd actually have to treat everything with absorption and you'd have no room left for diffusion. Doesn't make any sense. So the approach that most of us use is actually to use a mix of absorption and diffusion spread evenly throughout the room. Many of us will focus on 1D, or as Anthony Gramani likes to call it, 2D, meaning it only is working in one direction. He says 2D because there is a distance dimension, but it only works in one dimension. So on the side walls, it makes sense to use these 1D diffusers because the sound only hits it at that one direction, and so it makes sense to diffuse that way. And then as you move towards the back of the room where you start to get more complex reflections forming in a way that you're hearing and is audible, it makes sense to switch to 2D, or what Anthony would call 3D. And then same for the ceiling, it tends to make more sense to use these 2D, or as Anthony calls them, 3D diffusers instead of the 1D / Anthony's 2D diffusers up there. The ones I use are 1D diffusers, but they have some 2D properties to them, or 3D in Anthony's terms. And so I use them everywhere, but they actually make a proper 2D version of this, or again, Anthony calls it a 3D diffuser. I know it's all confusing. It's because he really dislikes the terminology that was adopted, but to use the proper terminology that was adopted, a 2D diffuser they make one, and it would be a better one to use in these other parts of the room. But I would not use absorption at first reflection points because there are lots of them, and that doesn't make a lot of sense. I would try to evenly spread things out. The other thing is that I see a lot of rooms that I think are too dead, and they often sound pretty good. But what I find is that when I get an opportunity to retreat them and make them more lively, they sound better. So there's a lot of debate and a lot of experts who even hold strong, hard convictions that you need to have like a very specific target RT will then admit that some of their favorite sounding rooms were actually much deader than they would typically advocate. I have found this. Anthony and I are part of these committees where we have groups of people that all design rooms. And so we all have a lot of experience and a huge database of rooms to look at where we know what they measured like and we know what they sounded like. It's not like the one room we did or even the 5 or 6 rooms. It's like hundreds, if not thousands of rooms across all these guys. I mean, Anthony's done well over 1,000 rooms at this point in his career. Peter Aylett has probably done hundreds, if not thousands of rooms at this point. I think he's definitely at least heard many, many hundreds of rooms. You've got Adam Pells, who I think is probably into the thousands at this point for everything he's heard. He didn't design all of them, but he's at least heard many of them and knows what they were like. these are all guys that have like a huge wealth of experience. I don't have as much experience as they do, but I've certainly at this point heard well over 100 rooms and maybe a multiple of that. And what we tend to find is that these really dead rooms still sound pretty good. And I think it's because if you were to pick a distortion you don't like, an overly dead room tends to be less detrimental to what we hear than an overly lively room, especially for multi-channel. Because a dead room is simply lacking in some spatial cues, which the speakers themselves can partially make up for, whereas a really lively room has inaccurate spatial cues, and you just can't get those out of your head. So my theory is that when people go from a room that's too lively to a room that's too dead, they perceive that as sounding really good because it is still an improvement over where it was. If you then took that same room and made it more lively in the right way so that it had a higher RT60 time or RDT time, but with a good amount of diffuse specular reflections, my experience has been that sounds better, and that most people, when they do get to hear it back to back, say, yes, okay, that's better. And so here's why I said all that. If you are using only absorption on the front wall, and this even happened to me in the last couple of rooms I've done, like I know better, but I tend to do it myself because it's easy. I find that the front wall ends up creating too much of the total absorption that's needed in the room. And then it becomes really hard to treat the rest of the room without making the room too dead. Now, this particular room came out pretty good. Like my complaints, most people would say that's silly. I think the room is a little too dead. But when you consider what the correct target RDT time is for a room of this size, the RDT of this room is actually in spec. So it's around 250 to 275 milliseconds. It gets up to around 300, 325 towards the lower end, and then it does go up from there at low frequencies. But it's actually relatively smooth and flat. I had been targeting 300 to 325, like in that range for milliseconds of RDT, and I actually would like to get it up by making some changes to the room. One of the things that kind of got me, which took me down lower than expected, was that I got a little lazy with the front wall. So the reason to put absorption around the speakers on the front wall when you have an acoustically transparent screen is because there's reflections that happen between the back of the screen material and the face of the speakers and the wall around it. And it causes comb filtering. And that comb filtering, it's debatable, but most people consider it to be an audible distortion that they'd rather not have. So if you add this absorption to the wall there's not an issue anymore. And so, or I shouldn't say there's not an issue anymore, but it minimizes that issue somewhat. And so it's good to put some absorption around it, but that often becomes a large area, especially if you do it over like the entire wall. It's also often not very thick, like 1 or 2 inches. Mine is a bit thicker because I thought if we're going to do it, why not do it right? So mine is more like 3 to 4 inches thick, depending on the portion of the wall. But then what I did was limited it to an area that's not even the whole screen. It's just a section of we'll call it like a band of the screen area. And then above and below that are open cavities. In one bay of cavities, I have a membrane across the whole thing with some foam behind it, like big chunks of foam, because I happen to have them. I don't know if you can see them behind me, but there's some sitting there. They're basically giant 12-inch wedges like you'd use in an anechoic chamber, and I had a bunch of them that I was going to use for something, and then realized I don't really want to have a whole bunch of chunks of 12-inch wedge foam sitting around in the garage all the time. So I used them. They actually would work really well for something like this. And then in the bottom, there is no membrane. There's actually just this absorption. It's the same thing. It's just a bunch of these wedges stuck in the big opening. And so those are kind of acting like big absorbers, in the top case, like a bass trap absorber more. But there was too much absorption on the front wall. So like what I should have done, and probably will change to when I redo the wall, and what I would recommend you do, is actually do a mix of absorption and diffusion. Directly around the speaker, I would worry that diffusion could do weird things and it may not be a good idea. I bet, I would want to test this, but I bet that you could design a shallow diffuser that's designed as sort of a faceplate that the speakers mount into for that area that may actually have good results. It would improve things and reduce comb filtering without adding absorption. But in general, the simplest, easiest solution is going to be to add about 2 inches of absorption around the speakers, say 1 foot above, 1 foot below, 1 foot or more to the left, and then everything in between, and then 1 foot to the right of the 3 LCR speakers. And then above that and below that, I would not add absorption, either add nothing or diffusion. And the reason for that, as I mentioned already, would be that you don't want to overabsorb, but it can't hurt to have extra diffusion. There are people who argue rooms can be too diffused, but I think our rooms tend to be so dead even when they're on target. Even when we're going for these high, I mean, even at 400 milliseconds, that's a pretty dead room compared to like really large spaces. That I don't know that having too much diffusion really is an issue if it's good diffusers. There are some diffusers out there that when you have too many of them, they're a problem just because often it means you're sitting too close to them. But like the good panel, you can't sit too close to it. I mean, you'd have to have your head right up against it within 6 inches to be a problem. So assuming you're more than 6 inches from them, they're fine. So I just did a room recently. I actually haven't heard it yet. They just got to a build point where I could go out to check it out. But we're not quite ready for that yet. But everybody who's heard it says it sounds really good. And it has way higher percentage of wall space covered in diffusers. Anthony saw it and he was like, that's a lot of diffusers. You can have too much diffusers, but nobody's complained so far. So we're going to see. This might be kind of an experiment of how far you can go. What kind of happened with that particular project was we either ordered too many diffusers or we ordered the right number, but other things changed. I don't remember now how this all worked out, but somehow we kind of had more of certain stuff than we needed. And so we changed from the original properly engineered design to, well, let's just put stuff up. And it still actually is the right relationship of absorption to reflection to diffusion overall. It's just a higher wall percentage that's covered. So when I say ratio, I don't mean ratio of wall space to absorption. That's way off. It's Anthony likes to do, I think it's somewhere between 10 and 20%. These are, I mean, I think we've covered about 80% of the walls with treatment at this point. But the ratio in terms of like how much of it is absorption versus how much of it is diffusion versus how much of it is like a mixed product, like the binary amplitude diffuser type product, is pretty reasonable, actually. It's all about where I'd want it. It's just a higher portion of the wall is covered. And the RDT time is actually on target because it's a small room. So it's interesting. We're going to see it's a little lower than I would have liked it, but it is a small room, so it is on target. And the reason why that one ended up lower is carpet, actually. If I had my druthers, we would not have done carpet in that room. We may take the carpet out. Anyway, so hopefully those two questions have been answered satisfactorily. If not, go ahead and re-ask and we'll try again. Thanks everybody for watching. I appreciate these. I keep calling donations, but the money you guys are giving here, basically buying some of my time to do this. It's really helpful. I appreciate it. And actually we had a hurricane, so you're also helping me to cover the cost of those damages. So thanks everybody. I appreciate everything you've done. I appreciate you guys watching the channel. I appreciate you commenting and being so involved. I have a very engaged group, which I love. And I really appreciate everything. The channel's getting more and more popular, and I think that's really cool. I'm a bit of a ham. I like to be in front of a camera, so it's always nice when people actually want to watch it and care about the things I say. It still amazes me any of you care. Thank you. So let's keep going. I got more coming.